Let's start with God's commandment that thou shalt not kill. On the face of it, this is morally intuitive and sensible, but it really means thou shalt not kill members of your in-group. Murdering others was fair game. Remember that the first thing that Moses did when he descended from Mount Sinai, bearing those freshly engraved stone tablets, was to order his men to slaughter 3,000 members of the rival tribe, men, women, and children, for having the wrong religion.
What he's referring to is the war with the Midianites, which is mentioned in Numbers chapter 31. First, it's important to note that although these verses speak of the killing of all of the males of the Midianites are mentioned later in Judges 6:1, which wouldn't be possible if the Israelites literally killed all of the males and took the women to incorporate into their tribes. The most probable explanation for this is that the verses are hyperbolic. There are actually many examples of this throughout history, such as a mention in a document from ancient Egypt that Israel is laid to waste and his seed is not, even though we know that the Israelites survived to this day. That said, we could analyze the language apart from whether any of this actually happened. But the language could only be described as masculine if, again, you consider the descriptions here to be consistent with being a good husband and a good father. Otherwise, a truly masculine culture would have to leave behind these ideas, regardless of how chimps behave. Furthermore, the idea that murder was okay if he was not a member of the Israelites is completely false and can be demonstrated by many verses. You shall not detest an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not detest an Egyptian, because you were an alien in his land. If you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, nor walk after the gods to your own ruin, then I will let you dwell in this place, in the land that I gave to your fathers forever and ever. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. Yes, there were wars. Yes, it is likely that even considering the hyperbolic language, immoral actions were performed by the Israelites. It seems that happens in every war. To characterize the Bible as being only heartless oppression of women and your outgroup, however, is to severely misrepresent the Scriptures. The Scriptures can be better characterized as preserving an imperfect understanding of the good within an imperfect culture. This understanding of the good is more fully fleshed out as time goes on, even to this very day.
How about rape? Now, curiously, the Bible does not actually forbid rape. It's not one of the 10 Commandments. This glaring omission is also related to male mate competition. Chimpanzees, for example, will form all-male raiding parties who patrol the boundaries of their territory, systematically kill lone males or smaller parties, and eventually take over the troops' females and territory. Hunter-gatherers have been documented conducting similar raids. It may shock you to know that the God of the Bible, based as he is on a dominant male primate with biological needs to compete for females, not only condones rape, but commands mass rape, along with infanticide, against the rival tribe. In Numbers it says, "Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known a man lying with him, but all the young girls who have not known man lying with him, keep alive for yourselves."
Today, many people think of sex in terms of consent, and as long as one consents, then sex is okay. But the Israelites saw sex more with regards to purity, and made laws based upon this. Hector is right that this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, but I think he is making a mistake to say this is purely the case because of a male-dominant perspective. In the past, for a woman to get pregnant outside of marriage would be a death sentence, since a pregnant woman would not be able to farm land on her own. The emotional damage of rape, while of course horrible, would not be the main concern. The primary concern would be living the rest of her life in poverty without ever being married, since men do not want to take care of another person's child for evolutionary reasons. Now, there is a case of rape in which Ammon rapes Tamar in the Bible, and she specifically states that refusing to marry her after she was raped would be an even greater evil than the rape itself. No, because this wrong, and send me away, is greater than the other that you have done to me. As Bishop Barron, commenting on this verse, states, the girl would have had at least some moral cover if Ammon agreed to marry her. But now that this is out of the question, Tamar is utterly exposed to ridicule and permanent social exile. It, of course, sounds shocking today that a woman would ever ask to marry her rapist. But thousands of years ago, people did not really have any other choice. Note what this verse does not do, however. It does not say that rape is perfectly okay because this is a male-dominated hierarchy. What Tamar says is that rape was wrong, but that leaving her to be a social outcast is even worse. And of course, Ammon is not simply allowed to get away with this, but he was later killed at the order of Tamar's brother. Now, the Numbers 31 chapter Hector mentions is the same Midian war we spoke about earlier, which I pointed out the evidence seems to indicate that this was filled with hyperbolic language. But let's suppose for a moment this was actually literally what happened. First of all, you have to note that the only commandment from God was this verse in Numbers chapter 31, verse 2. Take full vengeance for the sons of Israel on the Midianites. Afterwards you will be gathered to your people. In this story, God did not command the Israelites to take the younger girls for themselves. In fact, the verses Hector cites is conditioned by verse 15, which says, "And Moses said to them." This was specifically a commandment by Moses, not by God. So to attribute this to God is simply dishonest. Furthermore, this does not specifically state that rape was involved. It could very well be that in that culture where women could not survive on their own, they would rather choose to be married to men of the winning tribe than to be killed or left to die. Like Tamar, the Midianite women may have simply been making the best of a bad situation.
The biblical God hardly commanded a world of kindness, peace, and justice, but a very limited and self-centered sphere of morality. The thing is, we are moving towards a more globally interconnected community of nations, bound by economies, cultures, and technology, whether we like it or not. Insular, tribalistic religious morality that condones murder, rape, and infanticide against our neighbors is not only a liability, but also the very antithesis of what Prager is claiming here.
Well, ignoring for a moment that Hector misrepresented, misunderstood, and cherry-picked many verses in the Bible, he is also not considering what Christianity is today. Even if the God of the Old Testament condoned murder and rape, it would not follow that the church today does. In fact, the church most certainly does condemn rape and murder unequivocally. So what you are actually doing, Hector, is setting up a fallacious argument. That said, I disagree with Prager as well, as Edward Fazer points out. Masculine imagery is naturally going to be regarded as the appropriate sort to use when characterizing God's relationship to his creatures, for they are dependent on him in a way comparable to a family's dependence on a father, and he has authority over them comparable to the authority a father has over his family. And so the primary reason God is described as masculine rather than feminine is because God has ultimate authority, and masculinity is classically defined such that a man is the head of the family, not because we need to keep boys in check.
Now, some may argue that what we've talked about is restricted to the God of the Old Testament, but we can find the violent, sexually controlling, alpha male ethos in the God of the New Testament as well. For example, both Paul and Mark warn that any city that doesn't receive the followers of Christ will be destroyed in a manner even more savage than that of Sodom and Gomorrah.
What the verse actually says, truly I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. So it is not actually saying that God is going to violently destroy that town, but is referring to the judgment day, which occurs after the resurrection, at which time people who reject the apostles will be sent to hell.
And in Corinthians, women are commanded by Paul to be silent in church and to obey men. It is a shame for women to speak in church.
Yes, the scriptures do speak of women being subject to their husbands and to the leaders of the church. As Edward Fazer points out, however, this is simply in keeping with natural law. From the point of view of classical natural law theory, the fundamental natural social institution, the family, has the father as its head. And in an orderly social arrangement, there must be some ultimate authority, and that nature has ordained that at least in the normal case, it is the father in whom this authority resides. For when human beings are living in accordance with what the natural law requires of them, in the area of sexual morality, families will tend to be large. Obviously, this would put a very great burden on mothers if there were no one to protect and provide for them and their children. But protecting and providing for them is precisely what the father is supposed to do. And that, from the point of view of natural law theory, is why men tend to be more assertive and oriented to the public rather than the domestic realm, and thus more oriented towards leadership. Obviously, there are exceptions, but for natural law theory, it is the normal case that determines the content of morality. This is too big of a topic to get into here, but suffice to say that having the man as head of the household is not intended to oppress women, nor to satisfy man's desire for power. The purpose is actually to help men and women to achieve their ends, as men and women need each other to have a family. In this way, this is more of a complementarian view of men and women, where each has their own sphere of responsibilities instead of trying to make the two have the same responsibilities.
And per Paul, Jesus is even described as requiring virgins. Virgins are especially relevant to mortal male primates competing for expression in the gene pool because they come free from a rival's genes. But virgins should be irrelevant to an omnipotent being who doesn't need to perpetuate himself by biological means.
As you might have guessed, this is simply an analogy. Virgins are usually considered, even today, pure and innocent. It's like saying pure as the driven snow. This is specifically talking about people who are without sin.
The way that this video implies that the biblical God's way is the only way to live peacefully and successfully is laughable. How absurd it is that someone would advocate for subservience to this primitive idea when evidence makes clear that as a global society, we don't need him to succeed.
The good is something that fulfills one's desire, according to Aristotle. If you analyze human nature, you will realize that no finite good will ever fulfill the will, as the will is always capable of seeking more. Even the richest among us still seek things to fulfill their desires. Every time any of us obtain some finite good, we look beyond it to some greater good. This is because we are not really seeking this or that thing ultimately. We are ultimately seeking unlimited being, which is just God himself. This is important because once we realize that we are seeking being itself, we realize that we should value all things insofar as they exist, since to hate any finite being insofar as it is a being is to hate something which is primarily in God. This is very important societally because other moral systems are deficient with regards to determining what we ought to value. Atheistic hedonism, for example, suggests that we ought to value pleasure, but you will come to very different moral judgments under hedonism than under theism. A hedonist will argue, for example, that most people will not get more pleasure out of rape. However, it is certainly logically possible that someone could get more pleasure out of rape. And so, A consistent hedonist would have to say that if someone, say in biblical times, got more pleasure out of rape, then rape would be good for him. Under a theistic model, however, rape is wrong for many reasons, regardless of how someone feels. A woman has a right to choose her mate, for example, because choosiness is one of the things that makes her a woman, due to it being part of her natural ends. Preventing her from being able to choose her mate would prevent her from realizing who she is as a woman, thus preventing her from being to some degree. Since we value being itself as our last end, we ought to also desire that she actualizes her full potential, which means rape would be out of the question even if rape were more pleasurable. This is also a selfless moral system, because you are not desiring your own good above everyone else's good, but precisely as it fits within the order of being, which is ultimately set up by God. What you desire as a theist is that what God created you to be will be fully realized, but also that what God created everyone else to be will be fully realized. In other words, it is ultimately a desire for God's will to be done, which is logically implied from the internal dynamism of the will towards the infinite. And this is why we need theism. Thanks for watching.